And thank you for joining us as we continue exploring some great sites through the Journey Through Hollow Ground National Heritage Area. Today, we're going to be looking at Mount Zion Historic Park, and with us to help with that is Tracy Gillespie. Thank you for joining us.
Good to be with you, Ben. You want me to just dive right in and start yakking about Mount Zion with y'all?
Yeah, that'd be great.
I can do that. I can do that.
That's great.
Let me start, actually, I like to do this a lot when I do programs. I like to start by reading from a primary source that mentions our Mount Zion Church. This is a letter that was written in February of 1865 by a lady named Eliza Davis, and she and her husband owned a farm that was right across the road from Mount Zion Church. And she writes in February of 1865 to her mother-in-law in Connecticut. She writes, "It's a long time since I've seen or heard anything from you. I hope you're getting along comfortably in these times of war. You only know of war by rumor. I have lived on the battlefield for the last 4 years. Providence would see our barn and nearby Mount Zion Church as hospitals full of wounded, dead, and dying at the same time. At the present time, everything is quiet, but in less than an hour, a band of guerrillas or a squad of Yankees may come in large numbers. If they happen to meet, a skirmish must ensue, and some are wounded or killed, horses and men left on the side. It's often been the case under my own eyes. You would ask if I'm not afraid. I was, at the beginning of the war, as timid and nervous as most people. But now, since I have seen and realized so much of war, I've become hardened and almost fearless. None but an eyewitness had an idea." I like to use this letter from Eliza because she's talking about Mount Zion as a place of war. And of course, we don't think about that when we think of churches, because indeed Mount Zion was, it still is, a church. But it was both. It was a place of war. It was a place of peace, a place of worship at different times in its history. I can share with you, with your audience, a bit about this site. Mount Zion Historic Park is one of 5 sites that I manage as a historic site manager for Nova Parks. And we are along the Journey Through Hollow Ground, just about 2 miles east of the village of Albee. Mount Zion is now along Route 50. Back at the time it was built in 1851, it was built along what was called Little River Turnpike. And I believe we might be calling it that again at some point soon, as we're going through some changes in road names here in Loudoun County. So it was where Little River Turnpike, which ran from Alexandria to Albee, intersected with the Carolina Road, what we would think of today as Route 15, more or less. Good place to build a church, good place for people to be able to get to a church. We're an old school Baptist church, also known as Hard Shell Baptist, Predestinarian Baptist. In the earlier 1800s, the Baptist church split over a number of issues: missionary work, Sunday schools, temperance, even things like should you have a minister who's gone and been trained in some kind of academy or not. So the old school Baptist split away from the mainstream Baptist church that was nearby. And they built on this property and opened the church in 1851. So the church is just 10 years old when Civil War comes along. And as you might imagine, war comes along, we're at the intersection of 2 busy roads. You can't go to church during 4 years of war because it's not safe. And that's where I get into the church not so much being a place of worship as being a place of war, because in fact both armies used the church, throughout those 4 years, off and on. Many of you listening will know the name of John Singleton Mosby, and that Confederate guerrilla fighter who Eliza Davis mentioned in her letter I was just reading. He first brought together his men in January of 1863 at Mount Zion Church. That was the first place that his rangers met. And it would be used as a rendezvous site off and on throughout the war. It was also used as a place, the Union Army used it as a hospital after cavalry battles of Aldie, Middleburg, and Upperville in June of 1863. So it's a Union hospital filled with dozens of wounded or ill soldiers, most of them Union, but some Confederate soldiers were there as well. And then in July of 64, July 6th, 1864, it was actually a site of a fight between Mosby and his men and men of the 13th New York and the 2nd Massachusetts Cavalries. And they started fighting about a mile or so east of there and then swept back to the west and over the property and over around the church there. And it became known as the Mount Zion fight. So that's its place of war. Obviously, as you can imagine, the church suffered, the building, the structure itself suffered some during the war. Pews were used to carry soldiers, ill soldiers, when they were in hospital there. Stories have been passed down that some of the pews were broken apart to be used as coffins while it was used as a hospital. Doors damaged, shutters damaged. So finally, in the early 1900s, first decade of the 1900s, the congregation did get some money from the federal government to be able to repair the church. And I should note that the church did open again. Its congregation came back right after the war ended and resumed their normal services all the way until 1980. And in 1980, there were 2 parishioners left in the Old School Baptist Church there at Mount Zion. And those 2 older ladies decided they really couldn't keep the church going any longer. And so they started going to another nearby Old School Baptist church. It's an interesting, Old School Baptists are an interesting group to study. They only met once a month. The 4th Sundays of the month, actually the 4th weekends of the month, they met at Mount Zion. And they would start on the Saturday and then finish up on the Sunday. There would be long services, and they would have their elder there, who was chosen from the congregation to lead their services. So I can think of a few people who like to go to church, but maybe appreciate only having to go once a month rather than every Sunday. So again, by 1980, just 2 of them, and the church ended up having to be closed and shuttered for a number of years. Along came this is in a nutshell, it's history, but later in the 1980s and especially in the 1990s, fortunately for us, there was a group of local citizens who wanted to save the church. It was just sitting empty, more or less boarded up, its shutters closed. I can remember going in the church once when the Mount Zion association had been formed, and I remember going into the church and it had not been touched in all those years. And my husband and I both like to say that it reeked of history. It smelled of the past, and that was not a bad smell. Kerosene lamps, for instance, and things like that. In any event, this Mount Zion Church Association joined forces with the County of Loudoun. They were able to raise funds and do the restoration work that was necessary for the church. And then our Nova Park system took on the ownership of it in 2007, and we've been caring for it ever since. I'm going to stop now, see if you have any questions, and then I'll pick up from there.
Well, that's awesome. Yeah, that's a lot of great info, and I really like what you said at the end there, reeking of history. I think a lot of the sites to the heritage area might be described that way. So I'll invite Anjali Rose to come along on this with us, another one of my fellow interns, and we're gonna see through some questions that are around. Anjali, do you want to start with one?
Sure, I'll start with the first one. So what is the restoration or upkeep of the church like? How is that?
How do we take
that done? How is it maintained?
Yeah, how do we take care of it now? Well, Nova Parks, also known as Northern Virginia Regional Park Authority, we have actually over 30 sites in the Northern Virginia region, and I'll start by saying that most of our sites that we have are recreational in nature. So a lot of places where you can go and hike, W&OD trail where you can ride a bike, rental facilities, a shooting center, water parks, and then we have historic sites. And most of our historic sites, I'm happy to say, are here in Loudoun County, Mount Zion being one of them. So Nova Parks takes care of the upkeep. We have a central maintenance team that will come out from our headquarters from time to time and do some of the work that might need to be done. And of course, when needed, I'll call in, say, a roofing specialist. I was just talking with the head of our central maintenance yesterday. One of the things we need to do is a few improvements to our HVAC system, our heating and air conditioning system, which it really isn't adequate for the church. The church is not large, but of course it has a high ceiling, you know, a 2-story building with a high ceiling. So we have to work with a company to try to figure out how to make our HVAC system work a little bit better. I operate with a relatively small staff with my 5 sites. So I do have a custodian who, you know, just does the general upkeep of the church. The neat thing about the church when you all come to see it is that it is very simple. Old school Baptists did not have a lot of decorations, stained glass, crosses, things like that. They did not have that. So when you come to our church, I always find it interesting when we have students come, young people come in, and I ask them to look around and tell me if they think it looks like a church. And most of them say, you know, not really, other than maybe the wooden pews that we have, that it doesn't look much like a church. And then they notice 2 potbelly stoves, and they say that doesn't look like a church either. So on the one hand, it's good that it is so simple because we can care for it a little bit better. On the other hand, if you think about it, it is a brick building that was built in 1850, 1851. So it is always going to have some issues that we need to take care of. But knock on wood, nothing that's really serious for it.
That's so interesting. I think we have a question that would follow up right with that. What kind of themes do you try and emphasize for people that come, for students that come to the site? What can someone expect to hear about?
Well, again, going back to that phrase that I made up, a place of worship and a place of war, we talk about those. And I can tell you a little bit about this before we finish or anytime, but you know, we do open the church today. It's not used as a church any longer. It is a historic site, but we do open on the 4th Sundays of the month, as they did when they worshiped there. April through October, the 4th Sundays were open. I have a couple of volunteers there, and we talk about its history as an old school Baptist church. So we can talk a little bit about what that faith believed in. We can talk about the uniqueness of the church that has 2 front doors. Why does it have 2 front doors? Because men sat on one side of the church and women sat on the other. So they came in different doors. We have different doors on the outside of the church to get to the balcony. Why is that? It was segregated. Blacks sat in the balcony and they entered from doors on the side, outside the church. So we'll talk about the Black history of the church as well. Again, about the way that they worshiped and what an old school Baptist service might be like. And then a lot we do talk about is the Civil War history. One of the things you will notice when you come into the church, I mentioned there's not much in the way of decoration. You will see some graffiti on the walls. We have some Civil War graffiti, signatures of several soldiers who most likely, well, actually there's 2 different time periods they would have signed. One would have been when it was used as a hospital in June of 1863. And the other may have been when troops were hanging around the church. Oftentimes Union troops were there. They used it as a barracks for a short time. They even used it for a short time as a prison to put some Confederate sympathizers in there from the area, because again, this is Mosby territory. So there was time to time they might round up a few people and question them about Mosby. But these signatures are on the walls. We have identified a few. We're trying to identify more. So we really delve into its history during the Civil War when we have it open for Fourth Sundays. When we bring students in, we typically will have fourth graders coming in, of course, studying Virginia history, and they'll get a sense of that one site and all the deep history it has for Civil War there. So those are basically the themes of it, and also again, tied in with the Civil War is its geographical position and just what that meant for the church and for the congregation once war had broken out. I'll also add, adjacent to the church is a cemetery. The cemetery wall is historic. It was erected in 1852. The first burials in 1852. Nova Parks doesn't own the cemetery. It's still an operating cemetery, but we work with the association that owns it, and we do use that as part of our interpretation. And then just to the west of the cemetery is a section of the Old Carolina Road, which actually started out as a Native American trail. And we have a section of it. It's not terribly long, perhaps 3/4 of a mile long, but visitors can walk along it. They can read interpretive signage on the road about its very early history, about its history during the Civil War, and then how the road changed as we got into modern times.
Great, thank you. A follow-up question on what you just talked about. You mentioned fourth and fifth graders coming to visit. How do you interact with the local community around? Do you give tours? And if so, how does that work? And what sort of things do you cover?
Yeah, I'll tell you a little bit about that, and that can actually, I can kind of touch on what we do with programming today. As I mentioned, we're open on the fourth Sundays with our volunteers. One of our volunteers is a local historian. The other actually portrays a Union surgeon. So he's there and he talks about the church used as a hospital. We will open for group tours, and we frequently will have bus tours. Not so much the last couple of years, of course, of COVID, but we hope that that is in the rearview mirror now. We'll open for scouts. More likely we get Boy Scouts than Girl Scouts, but we'll get both. We will open, actually we'll rent the church for weddings, and as you can imagine, not every couple wants to get married in a really simple old church with graffiti on the walls. Oh, and I didn't add, we don't have indoor plumbing. So it's a certain, takes a certain couple who want to get married in a church like that, but we do have them. We do have them from time to time, and we offer programming throughout the year. Our first programming this year, again, I mentioned the fourth Sundays. The first of those Sundays is April the 3rd. Will be open from 1 to 5 that day. We also have a series, a new series this year. We're working with a Mosby historian named Eric Buckland, and we're doing a series called Scouting Mosby's Rangers. And that's going to be a 7-part series. The first of those, actually, that's the one that's Sunday, April 3rd. The fourth Sundays is not until April 24th. That makes sense now that I think about it. But Sunday, April 3rd, Eric will be there, and each month he'll be there and talking a bit about Mosby, but more talking about the men who served with him and the impact on the community around them during that time period. And then we also we partner with the Virginia Piedmont Heritage Area, and we have a series that's called Conversations in History, and look at history all throughout our time period. And the first program for that this year is going to be on Sunday, June the 5th, and we're going to have a lady by the name of Kim O'Connell, and she's an expert on Civil War graffiti. So she's going to come and talk about Civil War graffiti in general, and then I'll be sharing a little bit about the actual signatures of the men that we have there in Mount Zion. So you can see we try to open up and do various things as we can. Sometimes there's more of a focus on the cemeteries and its history. Again, the Old Carolina Road. We partner with the PEC, which owns property to the west of us. So if you're along the Old Carolina Road, you can go into the fields that they have. We're trying to do a little bit more with the property. I read Eliza Davis's letter, and Eliza and her husband, as I mentioned, were right across the road. So right across Route 50 today is another of the sites that I manage. It's called Gilbert's Corner Regional Park, and that's where their farm was. And so folks can come out and walk on that land, read some interpretive signs there. Someday we hope that you're going to be able to safely cross Route 50 and go between parks, but we haven't gotten to that point just yet, so I'm not going to recommend it. But you can park in one parking lot, do that park, get back in your car, cross the road, and then come to the other. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Great.
Well, I think we've basically touched on all of the questions we're trying to get at. I think we might want to get to this. We always like to ask our great guides when they take us through tell us about such cool sites, how did you get to where you are? And perhaps if you had any advice for anyone watching that loves history as well, or is interested in preserving such cool parts of American history.
Yeah, that's neat. That's a neat question. Thank you. By the time I went to college, I knew that I wanted to major in history. I was undergraduate at the University of Richmond, and by my sophomore year, I discovered something called museum education, which was teaching history, but not in the classroom, because I knew I didn't want to teach, and I love museums. So I went on to get my master's degree at the College of William and Mary in museum education. And I started at a small museum also along the journey, which is Loudon Museum in Leesburg. And I like to say I lived there for 16 years. I worked there for 16 years, 10 as the director of education, and then 6 as the executive director. And then I went to another site along the journey, Morven Park, on the edge of Leesburg, as the director of historical operations for 10 years, and then came here to Nova Parks. I have been very fortunate because I was raised here in Loudoun County. I'm not a native. I was almost a year old when I moved here, so I think my great-grandparents would have to have been born here for me to be called a native. But I've had the pleasure of living here. I've also been an observer of just how much the county has changed. So I'm always quick to encourage people to get out to our historic sites and to really experience the historic landscape and the stories that each of our sites have to tell. All those that I've mentioned today and so many more. I think the best way to learn history is to get out into it. Anyone who is looking at this broader field that all of us are in, public history, I think is a good way to put it. I won't lie, it's not tough to get to, excuse me, it's not easy to get into. There are so many wonderful programs now that you can take, colleges for undergraduate and graduate work. And it's really just persevering, getting your foot in the door. Anyone who's just starting in this field, you must volunteer. And we're always happy to have volunteers. I write really good job descriptions for volunteers and interns. And it's really just by doing, getting out there and then spreading the word a lot. I've also been fortunate. My husband's been in the history field also. He taught U.S. history as a AP history teacher in the county for 30 years. And after he retired, he worked for the Mosby Heritage Area and now the Virginia Piedmont Heritage Area. And now, as a fully retired person, he's helping me a lot. He volunteers at one of the other sites I manage called Mount Defiance, which was one of these 1863 cavalry battle sites. And he's one of the guides there. And he's going to be starting a Latin history course out in the field starting in April. And we'll have that offered in 2 parts. It's a 13-part course, getting out in the field again, getting out in the historic landscape and learning history. And I think once you hang around with people like us, those of you I'm talking to and so many of my colleagues, you kind of get the bug, and you just want to get out and learn more. And let me add, while I'm thinking of it, the programs I've mentioned, including this course, but also the conversations and lecture series, you can go on novaparks.com and you click on parks and you'll see Mount Zion alphabetized there, Aldi Mill, one of the other sites I'm on, and you can get in touch with me that way. I'm also getting all of these programs up on the calendar too.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Well, we really appreciate your time, and it's been a great conversation and presentation. Thank you so much.
I appreciate you asking me, and I wish you both, good luck as you continue forward, and especially with Journey Through Hallowed Ground. There's so much that all of us do together, working together and partnering. I really appreciate spending some time with you. I did this last year with Aldi Mill, and come back around next year and we'll go to another site.
Yeah, can't wait for that. So for everyone watching at home, thank you for joining us, and make sure to tune in next week as we continue to travel through Journey Through Hallowed Ground Heritage area and those sites. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.